Subscribe for more mysteries, unsolved and unexplained.
Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going on a seriously gripping journey into what is, without a doubt, the darkest and most baffling unsolved serial killer case of the 1930s. We're stepping way back in time to Great Depression-era Cleveland. Now, this was a city booming with industry, sure, but it was also just struggling with extreme poverty. And right there, in the shadows of its rail yards and shanty towns, this predator emerged. A phantom, really, who preyed on the invisible, leaving behind scenes so grisly that they literally shocked the entire nation. And the craziest part? He completely stumped the greatest crime fighter of the age. We're talking, of course, about the Cleveland Torso Murderer, or as he's notoriously known, the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run.
And guys, the sheer scale of this manhunt is just staggering. I mean, look at these numbers. We're looking at an official count of 12 brutally mutilated victims, though modern researchers suspect the real number could be 20 or maybe even higher. The police conducted a mind-boggling 9,100 interviews, and the investigation was eventually spearheaded by none other than Eliot Ness. Yes, that Eliot Ness, the legendary lawman famous for taking down Al Capone. And yet, despite all of those resources, all that manpower, zero convictions. The killer completely escaped justice. It really makes you wonder, right? How does someone commit crimes this heinous and just vanish into thin air?
Okay, let's dive into this and look at how rapidly the terror escalated. It started in September 1934, when a woman's lower torso washed up on the shores of Lake Erie. She became known as the Lady of the Lake. Then, a year later, in September 1935, two headless bodies were discovered at the base of Jackass Hill. And that is what officially kicked off the massive citywide panic. By June 1936, the killer was just brazenly dumping remains in Kingsbury Run, which was this impoverished area packed with transient shanty towns known as Hoovervilles. The killings continued relentlessly, on and on, until August 1938. And get this, the butcher actually left pieces of two victims in plain view of Eliot Ness's own office window at City Hall. I mean, talk about a taunt.
Now, to catch a killer, you have to understand their methods. And the butcher's signature was, well, it was absolutely horrifying. You have to remember, forensic science in the 1930s was in its absolute infancy. There was no DNA testing, nothing like that. And the killer totally capitalized on this. They completely decapitated and dismembered the victims, severing them at really precise joints. That indicated a chilling level of anatomical knowledge. Plus, they would completely drain the bodies of blood, which meant the actual murder often took place somewhere else entirely. So they were effectively erasing these victims' identities before the police even had a chance to look.
But, you know, even the most careful killers make mistakes. Actually, scratch that, this was a massive miscalculation. In a few cases, including the Lady of the Lake, investigators noticed this really distinct chemical treatment on the skin. The killer had applied lime chloride. Now, the intention was clearly to use quicklime to rapidly decompose and destroy the remains. But imagine the sheer irony here. The killer mistakenly used a chemical variant that actually toughened and preserved the skin into this red, leathery state. So they accidentally preserved the exact evidence they were trying so hard to melt away.
So while most of the victims were anonymous, lower-class drifters, people that 1930s society had largely forgotten, there were a few exceptions. Take Edward W. Andrassy here. He was one of the two men found at Jackass Hill in 1935, which makes him the first official identified victim of the torso murderer. Because his body was found without a head, police had to rely entirely on his fingerprints for identification. Now, Andrassy had a police record and had actually been an orderly in a psychiatric ward, but during the Depression, he was jobless and incredibly vulnerable. Getting his identification marked the true starting gun for this massive police investigation.
But think about it. Without heads, or when heads were found way too badly decomposed, identifying these victims was nearly impossible. So police turned to some pretty desperate, frankly macabre measures. They went so far as to create these haunting plaster death masks of the unidentified victims. When the head of a victim known as the Tattooed Man was found, police cast a death mask of his face and actually put it on display at the 1936 Great Lakes Exposition in Cleveland. Over 100,000 people walked past that mask. 100,000! To put that into perspective, that's enough to fill a massive modern college football stadium. And yet, out of all those people, not a single person could or would identify him. That just goes to show how completely isolated these victims were from mainstream society.
And the physical investigation on the ground, it was a grueling, massive undertaking. Around September 1936, Cleveland police found themselves out there painstakingly dredging stagnant pools and creeks. because the killer was basically using the city's infrastructure, the waterways, the rail lines, the ravines, as a personal dumping ground. Body parts were found floating in the Cuyahoga River, tossed into boxcars, or wrapped in burlap sacks and just left under bridges. It was an absolute logistical nightmare for law enforcement. It's like trying to piece together a giant jigsaw puzzle, except half the pieces are missing and the rest are scattered all across a major metropolis.
Enter Eliot Ness, the untouchable meets the uncatchable.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer desperation of it all. Fresh off his fame fighting organized crime in Chicago, Eliot Ness was now serving as Cleveland's public safety director. The public totally expected him to clean up the streets and catch the butcher, but Ness was hunting a ghost, someone who didn't operate like a typical mobster, and it left him profoundly frustrated. So the mounting pressure drove him to some pretty extreme tactics. In August 1938, Ness personally led dozens of officers on these massive nighttime raids straight into Kingsbury Run. They forced out the homeless residents, systematically cataloged their fingerprints so they could easily identify future victims, and then, in what was a highly controversial move, Ness ordered the entire shantytown burned to the ground. He literally destroyed the Hoovervilles to disperse the vulnerable population, just hoping to starve the killer of his prey.
Interrogating the prime suspects. Well, Ness's aggressive tactic of burning the shantytowns was a total PR disaster, but, strangely enough, no more official torso murders happened in Kingsbury Run after that night. Still, they desperately needed to catch the actual perpetrator. Out of those thousands of interrogations we talked about, the manhunt ultimately boiled down to two deeply flawed but fascinating men. On one hand, you have Frank Dolezal. He was a 52-year-old bricklayer who lived near some of the victims, and crucially, he had experience working in a slaughterhouse. He eventually confessed but later retracted it, claiming the confession was literally beaten out of him. Then on the other hand, there's Dr. Francis Sweeney, a World War I medical veteran who suffered from nerve damage and severe alcoholism. His primary duty during the war, performing rapid field amputations. And during his interrogation with Eliot Ness, Sweeney reportedly failed 2 early polygraph tests. So you have a slaughterhouse worker against a war veteran field medic. Both of these men absolutely possessed the grim skills necessary for these crimes.
The story of Frank Dolezal is just a tragic chapter in this whole saga. He was arrested by Cuyahoga County Sheriff Martin O'Donnell, who, by the way, was running a rival investigation to Eliot Ness's city police at the time. Dolezal was interrogated incredibly heavily. Then, in August 1939, Dolezal was found dead, mysteriously hanged in his county jail cell. While it was officially ruled a suicide, rumors persisted for years that he was either murdered or driven to it by abuse. Decades later, a thorough review of the evidence actually led to Dolezal being posthumously exonerated of the torso slayings. So it leaves this lingering, really dark cloud over the tactics that were used during the utter desperation of this manhunt.
So the crucial point is, with Dolezal out of the picture, historians tend to look really closely at Dr. Francis Sweeney, and the circumstantial evidence against him is incredibly dense. First off, politics. Sweeney was the first cousin of Congressman Martin Sweeney, who was Eliot Ness's loudest political rival. That made any potential prosecution incredibly delicate. Second, Sweeney had descended into severe alcoholism and psychiatric distress after coming back from the war. Third, and this is wild, he had a medical office located right next door to a funeral home morgue. Think about it, that provided a perfectly clean, hidden place to drain and dismember bodies. And perhaps most chillingly, after Sweeney voluntarily committed himself to a veterans institution, he sent these mocking postcards to Eliot Ness relentlessly. And he only stopped when Ness himself died in 1957.
But hold on a second. What if the killer didn't just stay in Cleveland? What if they moved? In December 1938, Eliot Ness received a really bizarre letter. The author claimed to be a doctor of chiropractic, or DC, and point-blank stated that he had moved his murder spree to California, even claiming to have buried a victim's head in Los Angeles. Now, while initial investigations out there turned up nothing but animal bones, this letter planted a seed, and that seed would eventually blossom into one of the most hotly debated true crime theories of the entire 20th century.
Because almost a decade after that bizarre letter, in 1947, Elizabeth Short, infamously known as the Black Dahlia, was found murdered and bisected in Los Angeles. The similarities between the cases are definitely tantalizing. Both the torso victims and Short were thoroughly washed clean of blood. Both cases involved the suspected use of a butcher knife, and both featured this incredibly precise surgical dismemberment. However, and this is a big however, Elizabeth Short was not decapitated. And remember, decapitation was the absolute strict signature of the Mad Butcher. So while circumstantial evidence definitely makes for great speculation, most experts agree today that there's no definitive link between the two.
Which brings us to the ultimate, haunting question of this explainer. How does a killer this prolific, this brazen, simply vanish completely? The Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run operated right during the height of the Great Depression. He targeted the vulnerable, the forgotten, and the nameless. He used the cover of a struggling city to execute a reign of terror that literally broke the legendary Eliot Ness and fundamentally changed Cleveland forever. And now, nearly a century later, those plaster death masks still stare out from the police museum, just silently waiting for names, while the butcher remains nothing more than a phantom in the fog of history. So, I have to ask you, what do you think happened to him?